There are moments in rescue work that stay with you long after the paperwork is filed, long after the truck has been washed and the equipment put away, moments that don't announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, through a chain-link fence, in the eyes of an animal that has stopped expecting anything from the world. This is one of those stories, and what makes it different from the ones you've heard before isn't the rescue itself, it's what happened the moment the cage door finally opened. The call came in on an ordinary Tuesday. A tip passed through a regional wildlife protection network, the kind of tip that arrives without photographs, without details, carried only by the voice of someone who had seen something they couldn't walk away from. A property in a rural stretch of the southeastern United States. 2 bobcats, living conditions that violated every standard of animal welfare on record. The officer who took the call later said she tried not to form a picture in her mind before she arrived. After 20 years in the field, she had learned that the imagined version was almost always wrong, either too mild or too difficult to prepare for. She drove out the following morning, notebook in hand, hoping for the former. It was neither. What the team found when they reached the property were 2 North American bobcats, adult, female, estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old, confined within a structure that had once, perhaps generously, been called an enclosure. Concrete floor, chain-link walls, a roof that let in rain but not enough light. The space measured roughly 8 feet by 10. For animals built by nature to roam territories spanning dozens of square miles, it was, in every measurable sense, a cage, and it had been their entire world. The elder of the 2 pressed herself into the far corner the moment the team approached. Her ears were flat, her body was rigid in the specific way that field biologists recognize not as aggression, but as something quieter and more troubling. The posture of an animal that has learned that stillness is the safest response to human presence. The younger one didn't move at all. She sat in the center of the enclosure and watched the strangers with eyes that held something harder to define than fear. It looked, to more than one member of the team, like exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a long day, the exhaustion of a long life in a very small place. There were no signs of recent hunting behavior, no scratch marks on wood, no territorial markings. Bobcats in the wild maintain an entire language written across their landscape, scent trails, claw marks on bark, the subtle geography of a creature that owns its ground. These 2 had nothing to mark. There was nowhere to go. Documentation took several hours. Photographs, measurements, behavioral observations noted in careful clinical language that could not quite capture what everyone present was actually feeling. By the time the legal authority to remove the animals was secured and the transport team had been called in, the afternoon light had gone pale and thin through the fence. One of the younger volunteers, newer to this kind of work, stood at the edge of the enclosure for a long moment before getting back into the vehicle. She didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. The organization that took over their care was a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center with a specific focus on animals deemed unsuitable for standard sanctuary placement, animals whose histories made them something more complicated than simply wild or tame. The staff there understood that what they were receiving were not broken animals. They were animals shaped entirely by circumstance. The difference mattered enormously in how the rehabilitation was designed. The first weeks were structured around stability. Veterinary examinations confirmed what the team had suspected. No catastrophic physical injuries, but a clear record written in muscle tension, in the condition of their coats, in blood panels that told a story of chronic stress stretched over years. Both cats were underweight. Both showed behavioral patterns consistent with long-term environmental deprivation. They startled at wind. They didn't know what to do with the sound of birds. Gradually, carefully, the enclosures were expanded. New textures were introduced. Soil, grass, the rough surface of actual bark. Enrichment items arrived slowly, one at a time, so as not to overwhelm. The rehabilitation team observed everything and wrote it all down. The elder cat, who the staff had quietly begun calling Mara, though they were careful not to attach too much sentiment to the name, began to show cautious curiosity within the first 3 weeks. She would approach new objects slowly, circle them, occasionally touch them with one paw before retreating. The younger one took longer. She watched Mara. She always waited to see what Mara did first. That pattern would turn out to mean everything. By the time the release date was confirmed, both cats had been in rehabilitation for just over 4 months. The decision had not been made lightly. There were real questions. questions the team discussed openly and honestly about whether animals raised entirely in captivity could successfully transition to a forest environment. The research on this was complicated. The outcomes were never guaranteed. What the team knew, and what every person involved had to make peace with, was that a longer life in a managed enclosure was not the same thing as a life, and these two animals had already spent enough time waiting inside walls. No one on the team knew exactly what would happen when the door opened. That was the truth they carried into the forest on release day. Not confidence, not certainty, but the quiet and necessary hope that sometimes, against the weight of everything an animal has endured, instinct finds its way back. Arnora. The morning of the release arrived gray and still. A low mist settled between the trees of the protected forest reserve, softening the light, muffling sound. The kind of morning that feels, without explanation, like it belongs to something important. The transport crates had been loaded before dawn. Both cats were inside, calm or something close to it. Mara had entered without resistance, which the team took as a quiet sign that 4 months of careful work had built something real between these animals and the humans around them. Not trust exactly. Bobcats don't offer trust the way dogs do, but a tolerance, an understanding that not every approaching human meant harm. The drive took nearly 2 hours. The convoy, 2 vehicles, a small team, moved deeper into the reserve along a logging road that eventually narrowed to little more than a dirt track through old-growth timber. The trees here were tall and dense, the canopy thick enough that the mist clung in layers between the branches. No roads within miles, no structures, nothing built by human hands except the trail itself, and even that was slowly being reclaimed. When the vehicles stopped, the team worked in near silence. The crates were unloaded carefully and carried to a small clearing just off the trail, a place chosen deliberately for its cover, its access to a nearby creek, and its distance from any human activity. The forest floor was soft with pine needles and decomposing leaves. Somewhere above them, a woodpecker was working steadily against dead wood. The sound carried clearly in the quiet air. The crates were set down side by side. The team stepped back, further than protocol required, almost instinctively, and the release coordinator knelt at the first latch. She paused for just a moment, one hand resting on the door. Then she opened it and stepped away. For several seconds, nothing moved. The forest held its breath. The woodpecker stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause in the canopy above. Both crate doors were open now, the darkness inside giving way to the pale morning light, the smell of pine and cold earth and something vast and unmeasured pouring in. And still, nothing. Then the tip of one spotted paw appeared at the edge of the crate. Mara moved forward 1 step and stopped. Her nose lifted. Her eyes, wide, amber, ancient-looking in the way of all wild things, scanned the tree line slowly, left to right. She did not run. She simply stood at the threshold between everything she had ever known and everything she hadn't, and she breathed it in. Behind her, in the second crate, something shifted. Here as Mara took her second step slowly, deliberately, the way a creature moves when every sense is working at full capacity. Her paws met the forest floor, real earth, layered and alive beneath her, and something in her posture shifted, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, with a sudden burst of movement and a clean, triumphant exit into the trees. It was quieter than that, subtler. The rigidity that had lived in her spine for years seemed to loosen, just slightly, like a fist beginning to open. She lowered her head and pressed her nose to the ground. She stayed there for a long moment, reading something invisible to every human watching, the accumulated language of the forest floor, written in scent and moisture and the passage of 100 other living things. One of the team members later described it as watching someone read a letter they had waited a very long time to receive. Then, unexpectedly, Mara turned around. She looked back at the crates, back toward the humans standing at the tree line, still and quiet, barely breathing. Her amber eyes moved across the group slowly, without fear, without aggression, just looking, taking stock, as if she wanted to understand, in whatever way a bobcat understands anything, what this moment was, who had brought her here, what it meant.
No one moved, no one spoke. Behind her, the second crate shifted again, and then the younger cat stepped out into the light for the first time. She paused at the edge of the crate, blinking, her nose already working hard at the unfamiliar air. Then she moved to Mara's side and stopped there, shoulder to shoulder, both animals facing the same direction, facing the humans who had brought them here. The two bobcats stood together in the clearing for what the team would later estimate was nearly 3 full minutes. It felt longer. The younger cat pressed briefly against Mara's flank, a small, instinctive gesture, the kind that speaks to a bond formed in shared confinement. In years of having only one constant thing in a very small world, Mara didn't move away. She simply remained, steady and present, at the edge of her new life.
One of the volunteers had raised her camera and then quietly lowered it again. Some moments, she said afterward, don't belong to a lens. It was the team leader who finally broke the silence, not with words, but with a single slow step backward into the trees, a signal, a release of something invisible that had been held between the two species in that clearing. Mara watched him go. Then she turned toward the forest. They moved slowly at first, Mara leading, the younger cat a half step behind, the same rhythm they had kept for years, even when there was nowhere to go. But now the space ahead of them was not 8 feet of concrete. It was endless. It was layered shadow and shifting light and the sound of water moving somewhere not far off. And it opened before them like something they had always been meant to walk into. Within moments, the tree line swallowed them whole. No dramatic exit, no backward glance, just 2 spotted forms slipping between the trunks of old pines, growing smaller, then gone. The forest closed behind them the way water closes over a stone, completely, quietly, without ceremony. The clearing felt suddenly very still. Several members of the team stood without speaking for a long moment, looking at the place where the cats had been. Someone exhaled. That was all. The crates were loaded back into the vehicles in near silence. The drive out of the reserve felt different from the drive in, lighter in a way that was difficult to explain and easy to feel. The work was not finished. It never fully is. Trail cameras had been mounted in the weeks prior throughout the release zone, motion activated, positioned along creek beds and game trails and the edges of natural clearings. The data they collected would take time to process. There were no guarantees. There never are in this work. The first confirmed images arrived 31 days later. Mara appeared on a camera positioned near the creek at 2:14 in the morning, moving through the frame with the loose, unhurried confidence of an animal that had begun to understand its own ground. Her coat was fuller. Her movement was different, not the cautious, compressed motion of a captive animal navigating a familiar cage, but something freer, longer in its stride, something that matched the landscape around her. 4 days after that, the younger cat appeared on a separate camera nearly a mile away, alone, hunting, crouched low in the underbrush at the edge of a small meadow. The image was grainy in the way of night vision footage, but the posture was unmistakable. She was focused, she was present, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The team shared the images quietly among themselves before releasing them publicly. There was no celebration, exactly, just the particular satisfaction of people who do difficult work for understated reasons, looking at evidence that the work had meant something. 2 bobcats had lived their entire lives in a space smaller than a parking space. Now the forest was theirs, and somewhere out past the tree line, past the reach of cameras and roads and everything human made, they were finally, simply, alive.